On May 3, 2006, at Zvartnots International Airport in Yerevan, Armenia, an Armavia Airbus A320 was preparing for a flight to Sochi. The flight was Armavia Flight 967, carrying a total of 113 people, 105 passengers, and 8 crew members. The captain was 40-year-old Grigor Grigorian, who had accumulated 5,458 flight hours, including 1,436 on the Airbus A320. The first officer was 29-year-old Armin Dovtian, with 2,185 total hours, 1,022 of them on the Airbus A320. Before takeoff, the crew received a weather report for Sochi. At that time, visibility there was 2,700 meters, with light rain, showers, and mist. The cloud base was 1,200 meters. However, the forecast for the estimated time of arrival predicted that the cloud base would drop to 210 meters, with conditions reducing horizontal visibility to just 800 meters and vertical visibility to only 60 meters. Therefore, the airport decided to load sufficient fuel. Not only enough to divert to Rostov-on-Don as an alternate airport, but even enough to return to Yerevan if necessary. Sochi International Airport is located on a narrow alluvial plain of the Zmika River, close to mountains. Because of this terrain, both of its runways operate only in one direction, and all approaches must be made from the seaside. At 1:47 a.m. local time, the crew received clearance for takeoff. The Airbus A320 departed Yerevan Airport smoothly, heading for Sochi. 12 minutes after takeoff, the crew contacted Tbilisi Area Control Center and were cleared to climb to an altitude of 10,300 meters. During the climb, Tbilisi controllers reported the latest weather conditions at Sochi. The situation had worsened compared to the earlier report. Visibility had dropped to 2 kilometers, and the cloud base to 170 meters. This immediately raised serious concern for the crew, since the minimum landing requirements for Sochi's runway 06 were 2,500 meters visibility and a 170-meter cloud base, while runway 24 required even higher standards, 3 kilometers of horizontal visibility and a 220-meter cloud base. If the weather remained the same upon arrival, they would not be able to land. 6 minutes later, while cruising at 10,300 meters, the crew contacted Sochi Air Traffic Control earlier than usual. They wanted to hear the latest weather report directly from Sochi controllers. The controller replied that the current weather at Sochi was already below the minimum requirements for runway 06. Considering that the fuel on board was far more than required for this flight, the crew planned to take the risk of holding in the waiting area, hoping for an improvement in the weather. But this was only on the condition that forecasts indicated an overall trend of improvement. Otherwise, they would return to Yerevan. At 2:16 a.m., Sochi approach controllers informed Armavia Flight 967 that the forecast for 2 hours later predicted a cloud base of 150 meters and visibility of 1,500 meters, conditions far worse than at present and well below the minimum landing requirements. 7 seconds after receiving this information, the crew of Flight 967 reported to Tbilisi that they had decided to turn back to Armenia. Tbilisi approved the request for diversion. Faced with the reality that landing at Sochi was impossible, the captain and first officer turned the aircraft back toward Yerevan, via Georgia. The story could have ended there, but ironically, it did not. 10 minutes after turning back, the crew once again contacted Sochi approach controllers to ask about the current weather. This time, however, they added that there was a Russian government official on board. The crew seemed to hope that this information would persuade the controllers to provide a more optimistic weather report. But even if the highest-ranking official had truly been on the plane, the weather would not have magically improved. This false statement was highly irresponsible, as it could conceal the crew's true intention to attempt a landing even if conditions did not meet the minimum requirements. A few minutes later, the controllers responded with updated weather data. Visibility 3,600 meters, cloud base 170 meters, lasting for the next 30 minutes. They added that the weather would soon change, but was normal for now. These conditions were significantly better than the minimum requirements. Yet whether this represented a genuine improvement in the weather or simply a concession influenced by the crew's misleading claim remains unknown to this day. Seeing that his plan seemed to work, the captain felt satisfied and decided to turn back once more, continuing towards Sochi. After receiving clearance from Tbilisi at 2:30 a.m., Armavia Flight 967 once again turned northwest towards Sochi. Inside the cockpit, the pilots began preparing for the expected approach, planning to use the instrument landing system for runway 24. At this time, the crew also reviewed the go-around procedure: a right turn to heading 240 degrees, climbing to 600 meters with a maximum airspeed of 200 knots and a bank angle of about 20 degrees. They also briefly reviewed the similar go-around procedure for runway 06, just in case. Both procedures required an immediate change of heading because mountains were located directly behind the airport. A few minutes later, the captain openly expressed his anxiety, strongly wishing to avoid a go-around. To this end, the two pilots devised a plan to minimize communication with Sochi approach controllers, thereby reducing the chances of receiving unfavorable weather reports. These actions reveal that the crew had already made up their minds psychologically. They were determined to land at Sochi and were willing to take potentially unreasonable steps to achieve that goal. Mentally, they were not prepared for another diversion. At 2:40 a.m., Rostov Air Traffic Control cleared Flight 967 to descend to 6,700 meters. At this point, it is necessary to briefly review how the Airbus automatic flight system works. The auto flight system has multiple operating modes, broadly divided into two categories: open descent and managed descent. When open descent is engaged, the system uses the flight control components to maintain the speed, vertical speed, and heading selected by the crew. Pilots set the desired values by turning knobs and then pressing the activation button to engage the selected mode. By contrast, in managed descent mode, the autopilot and autothrust take their parameters directly from the flight plan, programmed into the Flight Management Computer, FMC. Before takeoff, pilots usually enter the waypoints and altitudes to be used during the flight. The autoflight system can then carry out a series of complex commands to follow that route, either its lateral path, vertical profile, or both. After receiving clearance from controllers, the pilot set the altitude to 3,600 meters on the flight control unit and pressed the activation button, engaging the autopilot in managed descent mode. In this mode, the autopilot follows the vertical descent profile calculated by the Flight Management Computer, FMC. However, the captain was dissatisfied with the descent rate chosen by this mode. He overrode it by manually setting a vertical speed, switching to open descent mode for a faster descent. This choice increased the descent rate from about 5 meters per second to 12 meters per second. At 2:42 a.m. local time, the crew received clearance from Rostov Area Control Center to descend to 3,600 meters. 2 minutes later, they were instructed to contact Sochi Approach for further instructions. Upon establishing contact, Sochi Approach controllers reported the current weather: visibility 4 kilometers, cloud base 180 meters with light rain. These conditions were still above the minimum required for approach, but only by a narrow margin. In response, the captain decided to begin the approach. The controller warned the crew to increase their rate of descent, otherwise they would overshoot the intercept point of the Instrument Landing System, ILS. After that, Air Traffic Control handed Flight 967 over to Sochi radar controllers. The radar controller instructed the flight to descend to an altitude of 600 meters QNH and to begin a right turn to a final approach heading of 060 degrees, aligning the aircraft with the ILS localizer. A few seconds later, the captain initiated the right turn using heading select mode, which limited the maximum bank angle to 24 degrees. Because the crew had delayed lowering the landing gear and had not deployed the speed brakes during the long descent, the aircraft's airspeed had increased to 280 knots, far too high for this stage of the approach. At such a high speed, the limited bank angle in heading select mode made the turn insufficient, preventing the aircraft from correctly intercepting the final approach path. Worse still, the aircraft was still at an altitude of 3,000 meters, much higher than expected for that segment of the approach. This made slowing down without worsening the altitude problem even more difficult. In response, the captain decided to begin the approach. The controller warned the crew to increase their rate of descent, otherwise they would overshoot the intercept point of the Instrument Landing System, ILS. After that, Air Traffic Control handed Flight 967 over to Sochi radar controllers. The radar controller instructed the flight to descend to an altitude of 600 meters QNH and to begin a right turn to a final approach heading of 060 degrees, aligning the aircraft with the ILS localizer. A few seconds later, the captain initiated the right turn using heading select mode, which limited the maximum bank angle to 24 degrees. Because the crew had delayed lowering the landing gear and had not deployed the speed brakes during the long descent, the aircraft's airspeed had increased to 280 knots, far too high for this stage of the approach. At such a high speed, the limited bank angle in heading select mode made the turn insufficient, preventing the aircraft from correctly intercepting the final approach path. Worse still, the aircraft was still at an altitude of 3,000 meters, much higher than expected for that segment of the approach. This made slowing down without worsening the altitude problem even more difficult. Armavia Flight 967 continued toward the radar fix, with the autopilot turning the aircraft left to line up with the runway. As the plane descended to 600 meters, the crew prepared for landing. While waiting for clearance from controllers, the pilots discussed whether to continue the approach without permission. The first officer hesitated, but the airport authorities opposed it since the weather remained below minimum standards. The pilots continued to wait for landing clearance while extending the flaps to the first setting and further configuring the aircraft for landing. Shortly afterward, controllers reported visibility of 4 kilometers and granted permission to land. The captain lowered the landing gear, and the first officer contacted the tower to confirm readiness. The pilots then criticized the controllers for giving unclear instructions, saying that they had made their workload more difficult. When Flight 967 was at an altitude of 300 meters over the Black Sea, the cloud base unexpectedly dropped to 100 meters. Air Traffic Control, to the crew's surprise, ordered them to stop their descent and perform a go-around because visibility had worsened. After receiving the go-around instruction, the pilots made a series of fatal errors. Instead of carrying out the standard go-around procedure, they attempted the right turn while still in landing configuration, with the landing gear down and flaps extended. Worse, the pilots did not set the engines to maximum takeoff go-around thrust, nor did they press the go-around button or engage the go-around mode to let the aircraft's automation recognize that the landing had been aborted. Another critical mistake was setting the autopilot altitude to 1,060 meters instead of the required 600 meters in the go-around procedure. As a result, with the aircraft still in landing configuration, the automated system began a steep climb. The nose pitched up sharply, causing a rapid loss of speed and bringing the aircraft close to a stall, one of the most dangerous conditions in flight. With airspeed too low and the angle of attack too high, the aircraft lost lift and began to fall. When the pilots finally engaged go-around mode, the autopilot continued commanding an extreme nose-up attitude, keeping the aircraft in a dangerously unstable climb. The captain disconnected the autopilot and tried to manually push the nose down by pressing forward on his side stick. At that moment, the cockpit warning system was triggered. However, there was a lack of coordination between the pilots. The first officer, in violation of procedures, also attempted to take control, pulling his side stick back to raise the nose, while the captain continued pushing forward to lower it. This dual input caused their commands to cancel each other out, and the aircraft continued to fall. The crew had now completely lost control of both altitude and airspeed. under extreme stress, they were unable to respond effectively to the situation. In the final seconds, the pilots saw the surface of the sea and instinctively pulled back hard on the controls in a last attempt to recover, but it was too late. At 2:51:15 a.m., the Airbus A320 crashed into the waters near Sochi Airport. The aircraft was completely destroyed, and all 113 people on board were killed instantly. Among the passengers was a well-known Armenian comedian, screenwriter, and one of the creators of the popular TV show Comedy Club, Artur Tonian. The crash of Armavia Flight 967 occurred at night and in severe weather conditions, which made search and rescue extremely difficult. Strong winds and high waves hindered access to the crash site. On the morning of May 3, Russian Emergency Ministry rescuers, including deep-sea divers, began recovery operations. Armenia also sent its own experts to assist. In the following days, the bodies of the victims and parts of the wreckage were recovered. Several weeks later, the black boxes were found at a depth of 500 meters on the seabed. The accident investigation was led by the Interstate Aviation Committee of the CIS, with participation from experts from Armenia, Russia, and France, the aircraft's manufacturer country. According to the investigation's conclusion, the main causes of the disaster were poor crew coordination, flawed decision-making, and lack of situational awareness in complex weather conditions. The cockpit voice recorder revealed that after air traffic control issued the go-around instruction, the captain disconnected the autopilot and began manual control. The aircraft entered a climb, but the crew failed to properly manage speed and angle of attack, leading to a stall and eventual crash. Contributing factors included adverse weather conditions, low clouds, precipitation, and limited visibility. Sudden deterioration of weather, which caught the crew off guard. Crew fatigue. The night flight may have left the pilots insufficiently rested, impairing their reactions. Air traffic control pressure. The sudden go-around order may have added stress for the crew. Human factors. Disconnecting the autopilot at a critical moment and improper manual handling proved fatal. This tragedy became the deadliest aviation disaster in Armenia's history, and at the time, one of the most fatal accidents involving the Airbus A320.